On the night of May 6, 1974, the ordinary tranquility of Oregon State University was shattered as Roberta Kathleen Parks, a 20-year-old student, walked away from her dorm, Sackett Hall, and into the hands of one of the most notorious serial killers in history, Ted Bundy. For Roberta, the day had been emotionally turbulent, strained by an argument with her father, his heart attack, and the recent turmoil in her personal life. She sought the comfort of friends, perhaps hoping to find solace in something as simple as a hot fudge sundae. But what she couldn't know was that a predator lurked in the shadows, ready to exploit her vulnerability. This fateful evening would be the last time anyone saw her alive. Her disappearance became another chilling entry in Bundy's long, gruesome list of victims. It was the night of May 6, 1974, when Roberta Kathleen Parks, known to her friends as Kathy, decided to take a brief walk from her dorm at Sackett Hall. The sky hung heavy with an eerie silence, the kind that clings to the edges of a restless mind. Kathy had been carrying the weight of a tumultuous week, burdened by an argument with her father and the heart attack he suffered just days later. Though her sister had called with good news that their father would recover, the emotional strain still gnawed at her. As she left her room that night, the campus was quiet, only the distant hum of crickets filling the air. The walk to the Memorial Union building was short, barely 350 yards, yet it felt like an eternity. Kathy had planned to meet some friends, hoping the company might lift her spirits. As she walked, she thought of her father, the guilt of their argument still fresh in her mind. Her steps felt heavy, as if each footfall carried the weight of her unresolved emotions. Along the way, she ran into her friend Lauren. They exchanged a few words, a brief conversation about an upcoming Spanish test, but Lauren could sense that something was off. Kathy mentioned she was headed to get a hot fudge sundae, trying to escape, if only for a moment, the dark cloud looming over her. She smiled at her friend before parting ways, not knowing that this would be the last time anyone would see her alive. Unbeknownst to Kathy, she wasn't alone that night. Somewhere nearby, Ted Bundy was watching. He was known for his charm, his ability to blend into the world of young, hopeful women. In the dim light of the campus, Bundy's sinister plans began to unfold. He had a way of spotting vulnerability, and Kathy, with her conflicted emotions, may have seemed an easy target. The predator had found his prey, and Bundy, ever the calculating killer, would not let this opportunity slip away. The details of what happened next are shrouded in mystery, but investigators believe Bundy approached her somewhere near the Memorial Union building. Perhaps he used one of his infamous ruses, a fake injury, an offer of help to lure her into his trap. His charm, coupled with her emotional exhaustion, might have convinced her to trust him, if only for a moment. She didn't know that this brief encounter would lead her down a path from which there would be no return. Once Bundy had Kathy in his grasp, he likely offered to drive her somewhere, a simple, innocent suggestion. But the moment she stepped into his Volkswagen, her fate was sealed. The night that had begun as a brief escape from her troubles turned into a nightmare. Bundy drove her away from the campus, away from the safety of the familiar, to a place where the stars above bore witness to unspeakable acts. As they left Corvallis behind, the world outside the car grew darker, more isolated. The roads wound through forests thick with towering trees, and somewhere in that darkness, Bundy brought the car to a stop. It is believed that he struck her, perhaps with a tire iron, before carrying out the horrific crimes for which he would later confess. The forest, once a place of natural beauty, became a silent accomplice to her suffering. Kathy's absence wasn't noticed immediately. It was late, after all, and people had assumed she would return soon. But as the hours ticked by and she failed to come back to Sackett Hall, concern grew. Her friend Lauren thought it odd, knowing Kathy to be responsible and punctual. Yet, the possibility of something terrible happening hadn't crossed anyone's mind just yet. After all, bad things like that didn't happen in quiet college towns. The following morning, When Kathy still hadn't returned, her friends began to worry in earnest. They hesitated to report her missing, not wanting to cause a scene or get her in trouble. After all, what if she had simply needed space, time to clear her mind? But as the hours passed and there was still no sign of her, the nagging fear in their hearts grew louder. By the time the alarm was raised, it was too late. Bundy had already taken Kathy far from the campus, deep into the wilderness. Her disappearance would soon be linked to a series of other unsolved cases, young women vanishing without a trace. What began as a quiet night at Oregon State University would spiral into a nightmare that no one could have predicted. As the months passed, the search for Roberta grew cold, leaving her friends and family clinging to the faint hope of her return. However, her name soon joined those of other young women who had mysteriously vanished from the Pacific Northwest. It wasn't until nearly a year later, in March 1975, that her remains were discovered in the remote wilderness of Taylor Mountain, Washington, among the bodies of other victims. Bundy's methodical cruelty had turned the peaceful forests into a graveyard. Although Ted Bundy was not immediately linked to these crimes, his eventual confession would reveal a horrifying pattern of manipulation, violence, and cold-blooded murder. Months passed with no sign of Roberta Kathleen Parks. The world moved on, but for her family and friends, the waiting was torture. Posters were hung, search efforts were organized, and desperate hopes were clung to. But as days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, it became clear that something terrible had happened. The uncertainty was suffocating, as every passing day seemed to widen the void left by her absence. The fear that had gripped Oregon soon spread to the surrounding states. Similar cases of missing young women began to surface. The Pacific Northwest became a hunting ground for a predator whose evil was beyond comprehension. In March 1975, nearly a year after Kathy disappeared, the truth would finally come to light, though it offered no comfort to those who had loved her. Taylor Mountain, a remote, forested area in Washington, was about to give up its gruesome secret. Search teams had been scouring the mountain for days when they stumbled upon something no one was prepared for: human remains, scattered beneath a dense canopy of trees. Among the bones and skulls found that day was Roberta Kathleen Parks. She had been dumped like so many others, her life reduced to fragments buried in the cold earth. The discovery sent shockwaves through the investigation. Taylor Mountain had become a mass grave, a place where Bundy's victims were discarded after he had extinguished their lives. Along with Kathy's remains were those of Linda and Healy, Susan Rancourt, and Brenda Ball, all young women with bright futures snuffed out by a man driven by dark and twisted impulses. The mountain, once a tranquil place of nature, had become a monument to unspeakable cruelty. The details of Kathy's final moments remain a mystery, but Bundy's later confessions painted a harrowing picture. After he had lured her into his car, he drove her to a secluded location, far from the reach of anyone who could have helped her. What transpired in the hours that followed is known only to Bundy, but his later admissions revealed that Kathy was subjected to horrific violence before he took her life. She, like so many others, had become another victim in Bundy's reign of terror. As news of the discovery spread, Kathy's family was devastated. They had held onto hope for nearly a year, praying for a miracle that never came. Now, they were left to grapple with the cold reality of her death. The guilt that had once weighed so heavily on Kathy over her argument with her father now seemed cruelly ironic. She had worried so much about the pain she had caused him, and now, it was her family who would carry the pain of her loss for the rest of their lives. The investigation into Bundy's crimes took on a new urgency after the remains at Taylor Mountain were found. His name, once whispered in police circles, was now at the forefront of the investigation. The seemingly disconnected disappearances across the Pacific Northwest were beginning to form a pattern, one that pointed directly to him. Forensic evidence, witness testimonies, and Bundy's own cryptic statements began to weave together a case that would ultimately bring him to justice. But for Kathy, it was too late. Her life, full of potential and promise, had been stolen away by a man whose evil knew no bounds. The girl who had once worried about her Spanish test, who had confided in friends about her homesickness, was now another tragic statistic in a case that would haunt the nation for years to come.
Ever get that, eerie feeling? On a college campus late at night, it's quiet, almost too quiet, and you kind of feel alone, even though there are probably tons of people around.
Yeah, it's a weird juxtaposition. All those buildings, usually bustling with life, suddenly seem kind of empty and ominous.
Totally. And that's the kind of unsettling stillness that hung over Oregon State University one night in May of '74, the night Roberta Kathleen Parks, or Kathy, as her friends called her, vanished.
And she was just, a young college student looking for a little peace and quiet, a little escape from the stress of, life.
She was dealing with a lot, actually. Her father had recently had a heart attack, and on top of that, she was carrying the weight of a family argument, those kinds of things that just stick with you.
Yeah, heavy stuff. And sadly, all that collided with a really dark chapter that was unfolding in the Pacific Northwest at the time. Ted Bundy's reign of terror. I mean, people toss that phrase around, reign of terror, but in this case, it's tragically fitting.
Absolutely. Bundy's crimes, they weren't isolated incidents. He was moving through multiple states, and his victims, they often shared certain physical characteristics, like he was targeting a specific look.
Exactly. Long, dark hair parted down the middle, sometimes even an arm in a sling or a cast. This wasn't random, it was calculated. He was using a certain type to, almost blend in, seem less threatening, which is just, terrifying.
So Bundy wasn't just this monster hiding in the shadows. He was out in the open, using this facade of normalcy as a weapon.
It's chilling. And think about the social context back then, the 1970s. Women were taught to be polite, accommodating, not to make a fuss, even with strangers.
And Bundy used those societal norms, those expectations against his victim.
Absolutely. He was a master manipulator.
So on this particular night, Kathy, she'd had this brief, seemingly ordinary encounter with her friend Lorraine. They were just chatting about an upcoming Spanish test, normal college stuff.
And that's what makes it all the more haunting. It's those ordinary moments, the ones we all take for granted, that can suddenly take on a whole new meaning in cases like this.
It's like those everyday interactions become infused with this unsettling weight in retrospect.
It's true.
So Kathy, she leaves her dorm, Sackett Hall, and heads towards the Memorial Union building, intending to grab a hot fudge sundae, a little comfort food, It was a short walk, just a few minutes, one she'd probably done countless times before.
And that's where things get really murky. We believe that somewhere on that short walk, Bundy likely approached her. He was known for his charisma, his ability to project this air of trustworthiness, often using fabricated stories or scenarios to gain a victim's confidence.
God, just the thought of it. This young woman, already carrying so much on her shoulders, unknowingly walking into the path of this predator who was so skilled at manipulation that he could make his darkness seem almost mundane.
And that's what makes these cases so terrifying, so difficult to comprehend.
That was the last confirmed sighting of Kathy Parks. She just vanished.
And it's you'd think a missing college student, someone would notice, someone would do something right away. But there was this delay, this hesitation to really grasp the seriousness of her disappearance.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine that happening today. A missing student would be front page news, right?
So what was it? Did people just not think anything bad could happen in a place like Corvallis?
Well, you got to remember, this is the early 70s. Ideas about personal safety, especially for young women, they were just different back then.
Different how?
Well, there was this pressure to be polite, not to cause a scene. Can you imagine? And on top of that, the whole idea of stranger danger on a college campus, it was almost unheard of.
So Kathy's friends, they might have hesitated to overreact. Maybe they thought she just needed some time alone to deal with everything.
It's possible. Or they might have worried about going to the authorities, thought they wouldn't be taken seriously. Who knows, really?
Yeah.
But by the time the alarm bells really started ringing, it was already too late. Months went by, and then in March of '75, there was that gruesome discovery on Taylor Mountain.
Right.
Up in Washington State.
Taylor Mountain, yeah. That place became like a tragically important location in the whole Bundy investigation. You know, on the surface, it's this remote, almost peaceful place, but it's where Bundy disposed of a number of his victims.
God, it's just awful. And Kathy wasn't the only one they found there, was she?
No. Linda Ann Healy, Susan Rancourt, Brenda Ball, all young women, all found on that mountain. Their stories, they all got tangled up with Kathy's in this horrific way.
And each one of those names represents a whole life, a family left behind to grieve, right?
Exactly. Linda Ann Healy, she was studying radio and television broadcasting at the University of Washington. People said she was a really talented artist. Susan Rancourt, she was known for being incredibly kind, always had a smile on her face. She was working towards a degree in social work.
It's unfathomable.
And Brenda Ball, she was kind of a free spirit, loved music, loved to travel. She was last seen leaving a tavern in Burien, Washington.
So many lives cut short. And that fact that they were all found on Taylor Mountain, it's like, it really gives you a sense of Bundy's movements, the calculated way he was disposing of his victims.
For sure. And the evidence they found there, things like hair fibers, clothing fragments, even bone fragments, they were able to link those back to Bundy and his victims. It was all part of piecing together this awful puzzle.
But at that point, Bundy was still out there, right? It's wild to think about, right? Like, all of this is going on, the discoveries, the fear, and Bundy, he just disappeared for a while.
Well, he was good at it, blending in. Mm-hmm. Remember, back then, no social media, no Amber Alerts blowing up your phone. Bundy could move around without leaving much of a trace.
And his capture, I mean, when they finally caught him, it wasn't even directly related to Kathy's case or any of the victims from Taylor Mountain, was it?
Nope. 1975, Utah. It was a traffic stop, actually. Imagine that. The infamous Ted Bundy pulled over for a broken taillight.
But even after they got him, he escaped, right?
More than once. The guy was like Houdini. He even acted as his own lawyer during his trials. Imagine having the nerve, all while putting on this act, this charming, articulate law student.
Crazy. It's like you couldn't make this stuff up, but eventually he did face justice, right?
Yeah, but it was a long road to get there. Bundy kept his mouth shut for years, refused to talk about his crimes. It wasn't until he was on death row in Florida facing the end that he started to confess, to reveal just how dark things really got.
But even then, his confessions, they were often kind of vague, contradictory.
Totally. It's like he wanted to hold on to some control, even in his final days. Can you imagine being the families of his victims, waiting all those years for answers, for some semblance of closure, and then getting that?
It's devastating. And even when Bundy finally admitted to killing Kathy Parks, he never gave any specifics, no details about her final moments.
He took their lives, their futures, and then robbed them of their voices, of the chance to have their stories told in full. It's brutal.
We spent a lot of time talking about Ted Bundy, the killer, the manipulator. But at the heart of it all, there's Kathy, Roberta Kathleen Parks, a young woman who loved hot fudge sundaes, who had a Spanish test coming up, who was dealing with those everyday ups and downs of family. She was a daughter, a friend, a student.
And she had hopes, dreams, a whole life ahead of her. And it's important to remember that, to remember all the victims as individuals, not just names in a case file.
It's easy to get caught up in the darkness of these stories. But what can we learn from this? From Kathy's story, from the legacy of Ted Bundy, what can we take away from this deep dive?
It's a stark reminder, isn't it, that evil can wear a friendly face. That we need to listen to our gut, to trust our instincts, and to always, always be vigilant about safety, both our own and those around us.
And maybe, just maybe, by remembering Kathy and all the others who were taken too soon, by sharing their stories, we can, maybe find the strength to advocate for a better world, a safer world.
Absolutely. Their stories, as painful as they are, they remind us of the importance of human connection, of looking out for one another, of cherishing the time we have.
If you're interested in learning more about Kathy Parks, about the other victims of Ted Bundy, or about the ongoing efforts to support their families and find justice, we've got some resources linked in this episode's description. Take a look, and as always, stay curious, stay informed, and stay safe.
In the end, Roberta Kathleen Parks became a tragic symbol of Ted Bundy's monstrous crimes. A bright, young woman taken too soon by a man who masked his evil behind charm and intelligence. The discovery of her remains on Taylor Mountain provided a grim closure to her family, who had been left wondering for nearly a year. While Bundy's capture and eventual execution brought some semblance of justice, the pain left behind for Roberta's family and the families of his other victims would never fully heal. Her story, like so many others, serves as a chilling reminder of the evil that can lurk behind even the most unassuming faces.